but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
No, because they never do put enough garlic, and we should really talk about it. But also, one time, I got COVID back in 2020, and I was like, oh, MG, this is the worst. But also, I'm 21 years old. It should be relatively okay. I've never had any prior health issues. But then I started getting numbness in my hands and my forearms, along with really persistent headaches, which I never really had before. I attributed this to just being really stressed out because I just started the serving job. I was crying in the walk-ins. You guys know how it is. Yeah, you know how it is. But then my tongue goes numb in my mouth and I'm like, that's not supposed to happen. So I go to the ER. I pass out in the ER. Drama queen. I know. They tell me, don't even worry about it. You're just anxious. Like they were agreeing with me. I was like, I knew it. Like, so sorry to waste your time. I go back home. 3 months later, I'm hanging out with someone. My entire left side of my face starts to droop. They're like, okay, time to go back to the hospital. I'm like, no, it's just anxiety. Don't you worry. But sadly, not anxiety. It was a stroke. And I had been having strokes, apparently, because my internal carotid arteries were closing up to be this teeny tiny small. So they had to open them back up with stents. And I was like, great. Okay, that's totally great. We're done. Haha, that was traumatic. Putting that in the past. I fly to New York City because what else am I supposed to do? And then whilst in New York City, I get numbness again, this time in my head, and they find a big old marshmallow of inflammation behind my eyeball. So I go back home because no way I'm dealing with that by myself. Absolutely no way. In New York City, are you kidding? And when I wake up from the flight, no vision. No vision at all. So that's kind of unfortunate. And now it's 2023, and no one really knows why all of this happened exactly or how to get rid of it. So, Susie, if you want to send some pesto over.
Crazy if you want, but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
Dude, that's crazy. I broke up with my baby daddy 2 weeks before I was due to give birth, and then one night my water broke and I decided to just sleep on it. And then when I woke up the next day, I drove myself to the hospital while I was in labor. And then I got there and they put the IV in my hand and it exploded and there was blood splatter all over me. And then I was in labor for 2 days and it felt like I was being stabbed in the asshole by 32 knives. And I didn't cry and I didn't scream. I just laid there staring at the wall. And the nurses kept asking me if I was okay and if I needed anything. And I kept saying no because I didn't want to be a burden. And then I finally built up the courage to ask them to put a cold rag on my head. And then I started crying because I felt so bad for asking for something. And I verbally apologized to the nurse for asking for a cold rag on my head. And then since I was in labor for like almost 3 days now, my epidural wore off and I had a new nurse and she didn't believe me for some reason. So then she finally checked later on and they were like, oh shit, the epidural did wear off. And then they went to get the anesthesiologist, but the anesthesiologist was in surgery. And then the Lord's timing was just right and I had to push the baby out in that moment. So I shit the baby out with no epidural. And then when he came out, the umbilical cord was around his neck and also in a knot, which were two different things that could have killed him. And then they laid him on my chest and the only words that came out of my mouth were, how was this inside of me?
Crazy if you want, but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
No, Susie, that's actually crazy, but get this. A couple summers ago, my friend and I, we were leaving this bar, but as we were leaving, out of the corner of my eye, I spot this man that I think is pretty cute. Do I go talk to him? Absolutely not. But I do make really intense eye contact with him for a couple of seconds. But anyways, me and my friend are leaving, so we're kind of like out in the street, and he runs after us. He's chased us down. Wait. I think he's really cute, so I'm not concerned by this behavior at all. He catches up to us, and he asks me for my phone number. I've never had a man ask me for my phone number before. I was still in my undergrad at the time, so anytime I had interactions with men, it was always, can I get your Snapchat? Never my phone number. And so in this moment, I was kind of taken back. This felt very grown up. This felt very mature. This felt very romantic. And so I gave him my number. I was really flattered, but I also recognized he'd been drinking and he probably was going to forget all about me and not actually end up texting me back or texting me at all. And I was correct. He did not text me, but he did end up texting me like a month or two later. We talk for about 30 minutes. And again, we didn't really talk prior to this. He just asked for my number. That was it. So it's a lot of like basic back and forth information about each other. But then he asked me out on a date and I'm blown away. I've never had a man ask me out on a date this quickly before. Again, in my undergrad experience, most of the time with the boys I interacted with, the men I interacted with, it was, can I get your Snapchat? And then some weird talking circle situationship that lasted way too long. A few too many of those experiences. And so I was really flattered. I was very excited. I was giggling. I was kicking my feet. I was excited. And then he planned the whole thing. He said, we're getting dinner at this restaurant at this time on this date. Sold. Done. I'm excited. I'm so excited. This rarely ever happens to me. So now it's the day of the date. I'm getting ready. I ended up getting ready earlier than I normally would have because I had a couple errands I needed to run before I met him at the restaurant. But I'm like, my hair is done and I'm like halfway done with my makeup. I'm blending out my eyeshadow and I'm listening to some Britney Spears to hype me up on my Bluetooth speaker, right? And my phone starts to ring. And it's ringing through the speaker and it's so loud. I'm like, God, that's so annoying, but I wasn't expecting a call. It's probably spam. I'll just let it go. Not a big deal. But then there's caller ID on this call. So my speaker yells out to me like God from above, you have a call from the Lancaster County Correctional Facility. The correctional facility. I'm like, stops me dead in my tracks. I'm like, that's probably important. I go back, I go over my phone, I like look at it. I'm like, yup, the correctional facility. I'm like, I don't know what this is about, but I need to get this call. So I pick up the phone, I'm like, hello. And it's an automated voice system. And they're like, you have a collect call from insert his first and last name. I didn't even know his last name. I did not know his last name. We didn't even get that far in the conversation we had leading up to us going on a date. Didn't get that far. And they're like, do you want to take the call? I got to take the call. So I'm like, yes, I will take the call. And he answers, hey, well, I hope your day is going a lot better than mine. I'm shocked. I'm gagged. I'm shocked. I'm so surprised. I'm like floored. I don't know what to do. I'm like, oh yeah, like it was going pretty good up until this point. Like, what's up? Like, are you okay? And like, I don't know this man. He's a complete stranger. I barely know him. That was the whole point of going on the date, was to get to know him. And so I'm like, I need to be nice to him. You know, I need to make sure he's okay, whatever. I'm like, are you good? Like, what's happening? What's up? And he basically goes, I feel so bad. I really didn't want to do this to you, but I think I'm going to have to cancel our date. You called me from jail to cancel our date? That's insane. And I'm like, oh, yeah, like, well, don't worry about it. Like, honestly, like, this is not a big deal. Like, this is a pretty good excuse. Like, no, I feel so bad. Like, I'm not the kind of guy that would cancel a date last minute. Like, that's not me. Like, that's not fair to you. And I'm like, no, honestly, like, you seem a little held up right now. You seem a little busy. You seem a little, preoccupied. Not a big deal. And he's like, oh, like, that's really not me. Like, I can't do that to you. He's like, we could still hang out though. We could still hang out. You just have to come down here, maybe pay bail, and then we'll go to my Wells Fargo. I'll pay you back. And then like, we can go back to my place. I'm not going to go pay your bail. And just for me to go back to your place, dude. No, absolutely not. But I feel bad. I'm like, he's calling me. Like, maybe he doesn't have anyone else to call. I'm like, that's crazy to me. But I'm like, whatever. I'm like, well, like, how much is bail? In my head, I'm thinking it's some sort of misdemeanor, something, not that serious, something kind of stupid anyways, and it's maybe a couple $100 bail, right? Not that big a deal. $2,000. $2,000. It was $2,000. I'm floored. I'm like, like, see, that's not gonna work. I'm so sorry. Like, I do not feel comfortable. Like, I don't know you. I just learned what your last name was. Like, I'm not gonna pay $2,000. I'm so sorry. He's like, no, like, don't worry about it. That was a big ask. Like, really, I knew that was a long shot. Like, don't worry about it. I'm like, okay, but like, we have someone, his sister ended up coming, I think, and bailing him out. That's what he told me at least. And I was like, I feel bad. He's like, no, but I'll still take you on a date. Like, I hope you like bad boys. I hope you like bad boys. And I'm playing along. I'm like, because I feel bad too, and I need to get him off the phone. So I was like, yeah, I love bad boys. But I'm also a nosy person by default. Like, I just need to know. And he's been dancing around the entire conversation about like, what did he do? He wouldn't tell me. He's like, I'm not going to tell you. I'm like, well, what'd you do? Oh, like, I don't want you to think differently of me. You don't want me to think differently of you. You're calling me from jail to cancel our date, and you think this will get me to think differently of you? I'm like, okay. Anyways, I finally get off the phone, and immediately, I call in the troops. I FaceTime the girls. I get our group message. I'm like, you guys will never guess what just happened to me. Group FaceTime ASAP, debrief immediately, jaws dropped. Everyone's floored, we're cackling, we're laughing. I'm like, I cannot believe this just happened. And you know what? In my friend group, this would definitely happen to me. Like this, out of everybody I know, this would 100% happen to me. And so I'm like a little embarrassed, but we're laughing. But if bail is posted, that means his police report is public information online. So I go to the Lancaster County Correctional Facility website and I look him up on the system because I just learned his first and last name, so I can do that now. And I learned two very important. The first being that he lied to me about how old he was, and he was only off by a year, but I still found that out in the arrest report. So that wasn't like awesome, you know? And the second being that he was arrested for breaking a protection order. And I wasn't sure what that was, so I did a little Googling, and it's kind of like a restraining order, but it's put in place specifically for like domestic abuse and domestic abuse adjacent type situations. And so that made my heart drop. I was like, this was very serious. I help whoever the order was protecting. I hope they're safe now. I hope they're okay. But yeah, so that wasn't great. And then I'm still in a state of like disbelief shock. So I ended up posting his mugshot to my Snap story. And I was like, when he calls you from jail to cancel your date. And a few people slid up. They're like, oh my God, that's crazy. Like that would so happen to you. What does that mean? I don't know. But then my friend slid up and she's like, oh my God, like I don't know if I told you this, but I'm interning at the correctional facility. Like I'm getting ready for law school type stuff. I'm like, oh my God, no way. She's like, yeah, but I saw him get booked this morning. He was crying like a baby, sobbing like a baby when they brought him in. I'm like, that's insane. Like, no way. She said, yeah, apparently he showed up drunk to his ex's place, screaming out, yelling out that he was so much better off without them. And yeah, so he got the police call and they brought him in, and apparently he regretted it immediately. I'm like, damn, that sucks. Like, that's awful. But I obviously went and had to block him on everything. And I do hope he's doing better. And I do hope whoever the act was put in place for is okay as well. But yeah, that was actually literally insane, Susie. Can you believe?
Crazy if you want, but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
Susie, that is unhinged. One time I was bartending and this man comes into the bar and he looks all like disheveled. He's all upset about something. And he's like, pour me a really strong drink. I'm like, okay. So I make him his drink. I'm like, what's up? What's going on? And he's like, oh, this day is always so tough for me. It's the day that I lost the love of my life 30 years ago. I'm intrigued. It's a slow night. There's only like some townies playing pool over there. They've got a pitcher, they're fine. So I'm like all ears. I'm like, oh, tell me more. How did it happen? And so he starts telling me the story of how him and his girlfriend, they had this amazing relationship. It was like a secret relationship from her parents, because her parents were really strict and really religious. And they were just super in love, and they had plans to run off together and get married. One day he drops her off back at her parents' house. They say goodbye. Everything's great. They had a great date. And then she goes inside, and then he doesn't hear from her the next day, or the next day, or the next day. Days and days go on. He starts calling the parents' house, but nobody picks up. He just calls for days, and now weeks go by. He's still calling. Nobody ever picks up. He has no idea what happened. He's like heartbroken. Why would she ghost him like this? Why wouldn't she say something? Like everything seemed fine on their date. Like what is going on? And then eventually, like weeks later, he was just about to give up, and this time her mom picks up. And he's like, let's call her Julie. He's like, oh my gosh, like, is Julie okay? Like, I just want to check in. What's going on? I haven't heard from her. And her mom is like, don't ever call here again. Don't ever show up at our house. If you show up here, we will call the cops. Do not ever contact her again. Click. So he's just terrified, for one, but he's a young guy. He's like, what can he do? He doesn't want to get arrested. So he just moves on with his life.
But he never forgets her.
But I can't help but ask, like, where did this happen? Where were you guys growing up? He's like, oh, West Vancouver. I'm like, well, West Vancouver isn't very far from Surrey, where he lives now. Has he ever reached out to her now that they're grown up? Did he ever talk to her again? He's like, no, I have no idea what happened. I never heard from her again. And then I'm like, well, why don't you just look her up on Facebook? And he's like, what's that? Mind you, he is in his 50s, so maybe he doesn't know what Facebook is. And also the story that I'm telling you, it happened over 10 years ago. So Facebook was pretty new. He just didn't know what it was. So I just pull out my phone and I'm like, oh, well, what's her name? Let's look her up. Okay, so he gives me her name. I go through a couple people and then I find someone in West Vancouver. And I'm like, is this her? And I show him a picture, the profile picture, and his face just goes like, he's like, oh my God, that's her. He's shocked, right? So he's just staring at it. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, we can see what we can see on her profile. Like most of it was locked. He's just like mind boggled that this is possible. And I'm kind of going through the photos and like the things that I can see that's public on her profile, and I see that she has a daughter. So I'm like, oh, look, like she actually has a daughter. So I pull up the daughter's profile and I see, oh, she just had a birthday. She's 30. And I pull up the picture of her, and I swear to God, this woman has the exact same face as this man who was sitting at my bar. What do I do with this information? Well, I'm just like, look! She has a daughter that's 30 and looks just like you. He loses it. He starts crying. We just realized that potentially the reason why her parents banned her from seeing this man was because she was pregnant with his baby and they didn't approve of him, or whatever reasons they had. They kept it a secret and they kept him out of the kid's life. So that was crazy.
Crazy if you want, but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
Yeah, damn, that is pretty crazy. It kind of reminds me of the story when I was 20 years old and I went on a family holiday to Mykonos, Greece, specifically Paradise Beach, and I walked into this beach club and I said to my sister, do you see that girl dancing on top of the bar? She is literally the woman of my dreams. I then proceeded to spend the next 3 days with said woman of my dreams and we fell in love. I went back to Australia because I had to finish off my degree, but then 6 months later I moved to America to pursue the relationship. A short while after that, we ended up getting married because that's what people in love do. And then about 3 years into the marriage, she looked at me and said, I'm not sure whether I want to have kids. At that point, it was a non-factor, so we kind of swept it under the rug and I just thought, she's young, she'll change her mind eventually. Then about 5.5 years into the marriage, the same question got brought up and she said, I'm still not quite sure whether I want to have kids. I said, well, I kind of need to know. It's a yes or no thing. And she said, well, maybe I do want to have kids, but maybe I just don't want them with you. So we ended up getting a divorce. But that's bloody crazy that you don't like store-bought pesto.
Crazy if you want, but I've never liked store-bought pesto.
That's nuts. So one time when I was a little baby public defender, I'd been doing it for maybe like a year, if that. I was in a long court day and I was sitting there waiting for some of my cases to get called, and all of a sudden this guy just burst into the courtroom and he had full firefighter gear on and he was yelling 518 518 shout out, and court just stopped. Everyone just like came to a screeching halt and started looking at this guy, and he was walking towards the front of the courtroom, and everyone, I guess, thought that there was some sort of emergency. I did, and that, you know, the fire department had been called and he was shouting out some sort of like emergency code, and he kept shouting 518 518, and he kept coming closer and closer to the front. And if you know anything about a courtroom, there's an area between the gallery where all the people sit, and then there's the front of the courtroom. There's what's called the bar where the lawyers sit. And so I was up with all the lawyers. Well, this guy was like all the way up to the bar by then, and court security, they were just kind of standing there looking around like, what the hell's going on? And this firefighter man gets all the way up to the front and almost like right up beside where I was sitting, and he points at me right in my face and he says, Carrie, back then I had a different last name. He said, Carrie, you're fired. And I was like, what the hell? Who is this guy? I've never seen this guy before in my life. I have no idea what's happening. So all of a sudden, I guess the court security realized that he wasn't a fireman, and so they kind of like grabbed his arms and dragged him back to the holding cell where they keep the inmates. And so we took a break from court. Everyone was really confused. I was rattled. Not only was I new, but I just found out I was pregnant. So I was like, what? I have no idea who this man is. So fast forward a few minutes. I guess the court security like talked to the guy. They found out that he apparently was the much younger boyfriend of a woman that I was representing, and they thought that she had violated her probation. I got the judge to let her back out, but she had to go back into the holding cell to be processed. Well, this guy, her boyfriend, thought that I guess I had somehow gotten her put back in jail. He didn't really understand what was going on. So he decided to go down to his car in the parking lot of the courthouse, put on his full volunteer firefighter gear, which I guess he was no longer with the fire department because he,
you know, his cheese had slid right off his cracker at some point. But he kept the gear, put it all on, came back to the courthouse, walked right past security. I had nobody thought to ask like why there was no fire truck or anything like that. Walked right past security, ran up 3 flights of steps, ran into the courtroom, ran all the way up to the bar, all the way past the bar, and fired me on behalf of his girlfriend, all without anyone thinking that there was anything wrong. If he would have had a gun, I probably would have been dead. It's on video somewhere, and to this day, everyone still really thinks that it's hilarious to say 518 to me. And apparently 518 is not a fireman's code. It was the court date that the judge gave the woman for her next court date, and I guess he heard that, and it just like stuck in there, and that's what he was yelling out. So anywho, if you want to see video, I'll post it, but the pesto thing's crazy.